63,000 deaths from coronavirus. As the human toll worsened in recent days, protesters have gathered at several state capitals to oppose business closures in defiance of stay-at-home guidelines to slow the spread of the virus. And some of them are showing up armed. Member station WITF's Brett Schultes reports former U.S. Homeland Security Secretary Tom Ridge says they are not helping the situation.
The former Pennsylvania governor says he understands the very real economic concerns people are facing, but protesters packed together, often without masks, risk spreading the virus. Ridge, a decorated Vietnam veteran, takes particular exception with people carrying military-style firearms, some of whom shouted down nurses who came out to tell people they should stay home.
I think it's a pretty gutless enterprise to show up with a firearm and confront the men and women who are actually in harm's way. They're not in harm's way.
The protests have been coordinated in part by far-right activists. Kaiser Family Foundation polling from April shows 80% of Americans support the shelter-in-place guidelines. For NPR News, I'm Brett Schultes in Harrisburg.
Well, nearly every business in Georgia is clear to reopen. Some owners and employees are relieved. Others worry it might be too soon. Citing a continuing lack of tests, some public health experts are also warning Georgia's reopening may be premature. There's also some hesitation in Oklahoma, where restaurants have the go-ahead to offer table service now. Here's KWGS's Chris Polanski.
Most restaurants here are keeping their dining rooms closed for now. Libby Billings owns 3 restaurants downtown. She wants to see what happens first.
For me, waiting 2 more weeks is not going to cause me to have to shut down my businesses, but it could save me a lot of money and save a lot of lives. So I'm just going to stick with that.
Across town, Ricardo's Mexican restaurant opened for its first lunch service since March. Owner Thomas Hunter thinks they can keep staff and customers safe.
As long as they're practicing COVID etiquette, I think that we can safely start operating restaurants and maybe some other stores to get the economy back rolling.
Tulsa Mayor G.T. Bynum, a Republican, says the city will shut down any business not following health department guidelines. For NPR News, I'm Chris Polanski in Tulsa.
Though also eager to reopen, other states are taking slower approaches. Governor Andrew Cuomo is telling New Yorkers that if they stay the course, they'll likely continue to see a decline in COVID-19 hospitalizations and other evidence that, as he put it, the enemy is on the run.
That's what the close down procedures did. That's what the masks have done. That's what the socially distancing has done. And New Yorkers and all across this country, you saw that number change.
Cuomo is still ordering all state schools to remain closed for the rest of the academic year, affecting more than 4 million students. You're listening to NPR News.
Of course, what I would like is for somebody to say, on June 10th, you can go have dinner with your kids. That's not going to happen.
Imagine the TV show The Amazing Race set during a pandemic. That's sort of what it's been like as states compete against each other for personal protective equipment and testing supplies. Now, though, it appears the race for test materials could soon get easier. Reed Schuler is with the office of Washington Governor Jay Inslee. He says the Trump administration is now promising to send the state nearly 600,000 swabs a month, along with 430,000 liquid vials the swabs go in.
In terms of our level of confidence that this is on the way, the administration told us that their confidence is total.
In fact, Schuler says the state was told 40,000 swabs will arrive within days, with deliveries happening weekly after that through June. At the same time, the state plans to continue sourcing test materials on the open market. I'm Austin Jenkins in Olympia.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include the Arcus Foundation.
Over and out.
To the idea that people can live in harmony with one another and the natural world. Learn more about Arcus and its partners at arcusfoundation.org. And the listeners who support this NPR station.
This NPR station is 94.9 KUOW Seattle. It's 12:07, time for KUOW's Week in Review.
Welcome to Friday. Welcome to the Week in Review on KUOW. I'm your host, Bill Radke. We get together once every Friday, virus or not, and figure out what happened this week and what it all means. And my guests this week, I'm happy to say, are Joni Balter, the host of Civic Cocktail. Hey, Joni.
Hi there.
We've got Chase Burns, digital editor for The Stranger. Hey, Chase.
Hey.
Knute Berger, editor-at-large at Crosscut. Hey, Knute.
Hey, Bill.
And this is the first time we're at the risk of being like a Saturday Night Live sketch. Are actually airing our Zoom meeting. So we're streaming live on facebook.com/KUOW and on KUOW's new YouTube channel. You can find that just by searching KUOW on YouTube. And we're doing the visuals. And Knute, that's exactly the visual I would have expected from you, a very well-appointed library of books behind you.
Well, it's a joy and a burden.
Zoom in and find, and discuss each book one by one in a longer format that we don't have today. But
there's a podcast just waiting to happen.
It really is the next hit podcast. Joni, you look like you've got a sunny backyard behind you and some beautiful wood trim there. It's just also another classic placid Seattle theme.
There you go. Absolutely. Want to be out in the yard. It's May. Have you heard?
Yeah, it looks beautiful. Whereas Chase and I have both gone with the stark look. Chase, you're just against a white wall.
Yeah, I could do a 3D background and be in Hawaii, but I just want to be really simple and straightforward today.
Yeah, Chase is simple and straightforward. You guys are Knute and Joni are probably hiding something for all we know.
Absolutely.
Yeah. The only space I have to work in this 2-bedroom apartment is a bedroom with a small nightstand pulled up next to a bed that rides up nice and high, which means I'm kind of above the viewer. And the effect is like I just punched you, and you're just waking up to a very intimidating looking scene. Not a flattering angle, but
we call it chin cam.
What's that?
We call it chin cam.
Yes, waddle cam. There's a lot of words for it, and they all fit. Okay, let's get at our. Thanks for coming. Let's review the week here, beginning with the fact that today is the 1st of May, which means rent is due. Yes, it also means the annual Seattle May Day demonstration, which last year sounded like this.
To celebrate 100 years anniversary of the general strike.
This rally on the steps of the federal courthouse in downtown Seattle is the culmination of a miles-long march that began at Judkins Park.
What do we want? What do we want it? What do we want? What do we want it? What do we want? What do we want it?
Hundreds of people, shoulder to shoulder. No masks last year, unless you count a few tear gas resistant bandanas. Today, on May Day, demonstrators are not hitting the streets as much as grabbing their keys for a caravan. I'm going to ask our producer to air that piece of audio. Yeah, car caravan. I'm waiting for my computer to come back up. This will probably happen a lot. It has all week. A change in what May Day looks like and sounds like. Immigrant and worker rights advocates are leading a car caravan to Olympia. Seattle City Councilor Shama Sawant is leading a car caravan outside the Amazon Spheres, calling for a payroll tax on big Seattle companies. Other demonstrations today are for more coronavirus unemployment assistance and rent and mortgage relief, which to some people means a rent strike. So, my guests, who wants to start? What are the most likely results of these May Day demonstrations?
Well, I believe that, there's a lot of good causes to protest right now. It's not going to look like a normal May Day for us because, it's more of a hodgepodge. Who would think of in this anti-car culture that we'd be resorting to the car to make our points? I mean, there's an irony there for sure. Folks aren't really allowed to gather. Seattle Police Department certainly is not out to monitor people's content of things that they wish to say, but the way in which they say it. So if you see a whole bunch of people at a rally or at a park and they're too close together, you're going to have the police, hopefully gently, we'll see, breaking that up as they would if you were at any park in the city gathering too much. But I get using the car because it sort of becomes like your little mini Pope mobile for you to kind of be safe in there, but making your point.
Yeah, I've been actually really surprised by the car. It wasn't something that I expected a lot of these protesters to do. I didn't expect the Puget Sound anarchists to sort of do a car caravan in Olympia. And, you can protest without a car in a real space. The Transit Riders Union did a protest earlier this week outside of the city council. But yeah, it's been really interesting seeing all these pivots to cars for a lot of progressive organizations that have been typically anti-car.
Well, we should give credit where credit's due because the anarchists led the way on wearing masks. It's kind of hard to do traditional demonstrations when there's very little to disrupt. The idea of having a car caravan down by Amazon is kind of funny because if we weren't all socially isolated, they just get stuck in a big traffic jam.
Yeah, we're not talking about how dare they disrupt rush hour.
Yes, exactly.
Or non-rush hour in this case.
There are a lot of things that I think are worth speaking out about, and particularly on the coronavirus related safety issues for workers. I think that's really important, and there's an opportunity to do that today.
Yeah, it seems like these car caravans are sort of becoming the norm now. I don't have a car. I live in the city without a car. And I'm like, what would I do if I wanted to join one of these protests? I'd have to carpool, I guess, which would not be particularly, I wouldn't be practicing social distance then.
You'd have to sit in the back of a limousine.
What do you think will come of the calls for rent strikes or a government cancellation of rent?
Well, I'd like to speak to the proposal that I read. My eyes popped out of my head when I read it, that Councilmember Shawna Sawant is urging people not to pay rent even if they can afford it. Okay, really? This is terribly irresponsible. I don't mind talking about rent and forgiving rent and definitely holding off evictions. That's reasonable. It's a good idea. But what I don't like about this is it stereotypes landlords. They're all, I guess, sort of big, greedy, out of town hedge fund managers, or no matter what, big and greedy. But have you met a lot of landlords? A lot of them have one extra property, and they make some of their income from that. And if they don't get the rent, then they can't pay the mortgage. They're going to lose the properties. This is not. I'm sorry to say this, but this is when you elect activists instead of sort of policy people, you don't get the broad range of interests sort of accommodated from your city council.
Well, isn't Councilor Sawant saying that, the reminder that the system needs to change is in the word landlord, and that if the idea of a rent strike is, yes, people who could afford to pay rent strike as well. One person refusing to pay rent is not a rent strike. It's not a movement. It's not change.
I think you can still make your point without really harming all these other people down the line.
Yeah, and to that point, Bill, when you said, one person isn't a rent strike, it's just not paying rent. I think that's a lot of what's behind The organizing that Sawant's been encouraging, when you mention like people who have the ability to pay rent to not pay rent, it's often in solidarity. If you're in a big apartment building and your apartment building is organizing a rent strike, what it really needs is it needs the buy-in from that whole apartment building in order for that strike to be effective at all. Again, just one individual not paying rent there aren't protections for rent strikers, and so you need a group to be able to have some sort of weight behind that.
Well, I think I'm uncomfortable with the approach of a rent strike, partly for the reasons Joni says, which is, I mean, if you can afford to pay rent, I think you should pay rent. And if you can't afford to pay rent, that's a different issue. And I think there are policies such as subsidizing rents or other things. They're not necessarily immediate, but I think painting landlords with a broad brush as sort of the enemy and forcing them to bear the extra burden, I think is unfair. But I also think that it's divisive. Just like these demonstrations to open everything up now and in Olympia and elsewhere, I think are very divisive. You know, we talk about how coronavirus is like World War II. It's a war and we're fighting an invisible enemy. And well, you know, in wartime, I think you try and come together and work things out. I think people can work out a lot by talking to landlords and attempting to appeal for some kind of accommodation as opposed to doing rent strikes. I think that's a very dubious way to approach this.
Well, why is the call to open everything up? Why do you find that divisive?
Well, when people show up with assault weapons, military grade weapons on the stairs of a Capitol building in these public spaces, I just don't, there's nothing democratic about that. That's intimidation, that's hostility. There are also demonstrations, unlike these car caravans, these are demonstrations where people are putting other people at risk by not wearing masks and by not adhering to the public safety rules about keeping distance and that kind of thing. They are people going into the democratic public space and they are threatening us. I think it is a threat.
Of demonstrations, you know, these last few months, I've been talking to epidemiologists and virologists and of course elected officials and restaurant owners and grief counselors. And last week we heard from another group, the anglers, Washingtonians who are sick of a virus and a governor keeping their lines out of the water.
It's naturally social distancing. I don't know any fisherman that says, hey, you know, like come to my spot. You don't see fishermen going, hey, here's my secret spot, come here.
Well, I'm an off-grid person and I rely on it to feed my family. And if we can go out boating and water skiing and can't drop a line in the water, it's awfully ridiculous.
Well, you got your wish, anglers. This week, the governor allowed fishing, hunting, and golfing starting next week. Inslee also allowed some construction to restart. But today, Friday, he's expected to announce his stay-at-home order will remain beyond this Monday. Chase, how's the governor determining when we get to not stay home?
Well, the governor has 5 dials that he revealed earlier this week, and the dials sort of go from low risk to high risk. And what he's trying to do and what the state's trying to do is to get all those 5 dials to dial down to low risk. And that will determine when certain restrictions will be lifted. Do you want to know what those dials are?
You could run through the dials for us.
Great. So we got disease activity. So that's how many COVID cases do we have? We got risk to vulnerable populations. So that would be like how many outbreaks are happening in a long-term care facility. We've got testing capacity and availability. That's another dial. And that one's actually ramped up pretty high in Washington state. We're not able to do a lot of tests. That's a big concern. A 4th dial is case and contact investigation. So how quickly are we able to trace those cases? Right now, that's also pretty high risk. And then the fifth is the healthcare system's readiness. And in Washington State, we're doing, pretty okay with that, pretty good. But obviously, if we release social distancing guidelines too quickly, that could ramp up as well.
And Knute, you have some personal dial experience when it comes to testing capacity.
The testing thing really is frustrating because you get completely conflicting messages. We heard last week that the UW was going to be doing testing. It was open to anybody. I have a family member who went in, had a doctor's approval to go get a test at Kaiser. Apparently they were about the first person to do this. The test was taken and then sent to the wrong lab. There was a story in the Seattle Times today about people who have had great difficulty in getting tested. If you're going to ask people to come in and get a test and then not give them the test or make them come back for a second test, and it's not broad-based, you just don't have whatever you need in place to, reopen society. And I think that, again, I mean, this kind of goes back to the World War II thing, but it's like, I just cannot believe the degree to which the federal government has not been engaged in solving this problem and the time it's taken. I mean, it's May and people can't get tested. I mean, only in so they're ramping up and that's great, but I'll believe it when I see it.
So, oh my gosh, this is one of the big disasters of this pandemic is the testing has been off and wrongly promised since the very beginning. It's something they are just, I'm so tired of hearing, numbers of tests that'll be available and the ability to process them. This has not been a high mark in this. And for us here, and I'm hearing that the Inslee order will extend to late May. And one of the key reasons is the bar has changed from the original, are we going to crash the healthcare system, to how do we stop this? And the reason, and Chase, you did a good job there outlining some of the things they're measuring. We need to stop the spread of this virus. We still have hundreds of cases a day. And so if we open up, and there's so much pressure on this, and we can sort of drill down on each of the businesses and industries in a bit, but if we open too fast, these hundreds of cases will go back, the number will go back up. We will be maybe not back to the beginning, but back to a beginning of where we have to hunker down again. And so that is the problem. And the data right now on sort of how we're doing, it's better. We're better than a lot of places. We're in the top 5 states, I think, for sort of handling this, but it's still not where it needs to be. And so that is why you'll hear today that we're going to be in this for a while longer, while things sort of gradually open.
Chase, aren't we hearing from more and more people saying we were okay with the first goal, which was to let's not crash the healthcare system, but now we're talking about a virus that we're probably not going to get a vaccine anytime soon. And some people are looking at Sweden, places like Sweden, where they supposedly let the virus run. And they're saying the health system's not crashing. People are going to get sick. And so we are delaying the infections because the virus is going to hang around, and we're doing it at incredible cost to the economy and people's livelihoods. Is that about right?
Yeah, I mean, it's really precarious because we don't fully understand how antibodies work with COVID-19, and we do need to open up at a certain point. But you also have businesses like Amazon, who said that they were going to extend work from home until October. And so when that happens, you have a lot of people being like, oh no, are we going to have to do this until October? Because Amazon and Microsoft, they really set the pace earlier in March about people working from home. And so there is a dance you have to do, and you have to allow certain spaces and businesses to reopen, but
Sorry, Chase.
How
beginning because we're getting that you were breaking up a lot, and kind of freezing up, at least on my computer. Is that just mine or is that everybody?
No, I heard it.
Oh, me too.
Chase, do we have you or do you need to reconnect? Okay, Chase might be reconnecting. Let me switch over to the this business. Well, we have an example in Eastern Washington, but this is President Trump talking about a business he'd like to keep open on better terms.
We're going to sign an executive order today, I believe, and that'll solve any liability problems where they had certain liability problems, and we'll be in very good shape. We're working with Tyson, which is one of the big companies in that world, and we always work with the farmers. There's plenty of supply. There's plenty of, as you know, there's plenty of supply. It's distribution, and we will probably have that today solved. It was a very unique circumstance because of liability.
We're working with Tyson. Tyson means meat processing. In Knute, we have a big Tyson meat plant near the Tri-Cities area. Would that be included in the president's liability fixes?
Well, I would assume so. They have quite a number of cases of employees with COVID-19 have shown up, and this is happening across the country. So, you know, he's very eager to mobilize to save the meat chain. And, you know, the issue there is, of course, not that people are going to get sick through the meat that's processed or the poultry or whatever. It's the conditions under which the employees have to work. And you know, you cannot sign a blank check you know, for folks to get sick. And so, you know, clearly these processing plants are going to have to adjust the way they do things in order for people to work there safely.
So this is not just about it's not the meat industry alone asking for liability protections. What kind of is this going to be an increasing issue, or we're going to see liability issues removed on businesses so that they can reopen at the possible great danger?
Well, I'm not sure that's something that president can decide with an executive order, for one thing. So you can bet there are going to be lawsuits no matter what, because you can't just you know, do that, I think, with a stroke of a pen.
What is a business's liability in general? If I go to Nordstrom and I come down with the flu a few days later, I don't think of suing Nordstrom, but does that change in a pandemic? What are the rules around that?
Well, that's a great question, but you certainly have state and federal law that relate to workplace safety and providing work you know, requirements. So there are legal requirements, and if you break those laws, you would be subject to some kind of penalty. Now, whether that means that you could then in every case take some sort of civil action, I don't know, but anybody who's in the class action suit business is probably waiting for things to open up a bit.
Any other thoughts on to open or not to open?
Well, you know, the business liability, just think about it. So of all the things businesses as they slowly open have to worry about, you know, can they like in a restaurant keep people spaced far enough to make it, you know, reasonable to argue that they're a safe place? Come on out, come to the restaurant. They shouldn't have to worry about them being sued as a business for somebody came in, met someone there, or was waited on by somebody there, and then caught coronavirus, and now that business owner's liable. So you can see that. I was totally grossed out by the president ordering those people to work in the meat plant without taking. Now they did say there would be some precautions. There would be, you know, additional personal protective equipment and that, you know, masks and things like that. But sometimes they do and sometimes they don't deliver on those. So until those places are safe to work, I just found that just terrifying.
Okay, when we come back on the Week in Review, I'm Bill Radke. I'm nowhere near Joni Balter or Chase Burns or Knute Berger. We're doing this remotely, and when the show is done, I can just click hang up or leave meeting or whatever it is and go on with my solitary life. The question we're going to get to in a moment is, in Seattle, do we secretly like it that way? Stay tuned for the Week in Review.
Hi, this is Jeannie Yandel from KUOW. Since we can't gather in person these days, we'd like to invite you to a new weekly interactive virtual series called Are We Going to Be Okay? We'll hear from community members across industries as we check in and explore this new, hopefully temporary reality. Find out more about the series and RSVP at kuow.org/events.
Support for KUOW comes from Cambium Landscape. Since 1998, working with clients' tastes and home architecture to create landscapes that complement their lifestyles. Reminding listeners that we will get through this and look forward to garden parties. Meanwhile, practicing stay home, stay safe. Portfolio online at cambiumlandscape.com.
This is 94.9 KUOW, Seattle's NPR news station. Sound stories, sound voices. It's 12:32. And we return to KUOW's Week in Review.
I'm Bill Radke, and I'm virtually with Crosscut's editor-at-large, Knute Berger, The Stranger's digital editor, Chase Burns, Civic Cocktails host, Joni Balter. We're doing this on Zoom, and you can watch it if you like. We're streaming live on facebook.com/KUOW and on KUOW's new YouTube channel. You just search KUOW on YouTube. And after this conversation, I'll be back to being alone a lot or being just with my family, and I'm not making social plans. And I keep hearing that this is an advantage Seattle has in the pandemic, is that isolation comes easy to us because we prefer being socially distant here. And this line got repeated this week in the New Yorker, quote, "New Yorkers are in your face whether you like it or not. In Seattle, efforts at social distancing may have been aided by local attitudes. Newcomers are warned of the Seattle freeze, which one local columnist compared to the popular girl in high school who always smiles and says hello, but doesn't know your name and doesn't care to." So I want to know, is the Seattle freeze real? And even if it is, does that really mean this plague is easier on us than on New Yorkers or Floridians or anyone else? So Knute, I'll start with you. You think the Seattle freeze exists, right?
Yeah, I do think it exists. I was raised in it. I practice it to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a more complicated phenomenon. It's part of it is like that columnist, who was not me, by the way, said about the high school thing, which is it's a surface friendliness, but then a kind of with privacy and oriented thing. I have to admit, I kind of like the empty streets. I like the quiet. I don't like what's causing it, but it doesn't bother me. I've been looking into the history of the Seattle freeze, trying to figure out, like, when did this phenomenon start? Because the Denny's and the Borans and the people who settled Seattle didn't talk about the Seattle freeze. So, and I've traced it back to 100 years ago. It's the earliest I can find of a kind of public debate over Seattle's attitude toward newcomers. And in 1920, the Seattle Chamber of Commerce decided to initiate a Talk to Your Neighbor Day, because Seattleites, when a newcomer would say, gee, it might rain today, a Seattleite on the trolley would just grunt back at them or give them a monosyllabic answer. So it's clearly been an issue for quite some time that there's kind of both a tension between newcomers and old timers, but also that Seattle, this beautiful green city, sort of promises all these virtues of a wonderful place to live, but the inhabitants don't necessarily live up to the expectations people have of the beauty.
Well, but I don't think that's the reason why in that New Yorker piece that Seattle is doing better. There were like a zillion really legitimate reasons that we're doing better, having to do with just the way, and Dow Constantine, King County executive, got credit in that piece, and he deserved it for putting the doctors and the experts out front first and letting them speak one voice, keeping the politicians back so that they didn't kind of, argue and muck up the message, because people believe doctors at times like this better. We're a less dense city. We're more spread out. Yes, we love our transit, but we're not as reliant on it as folks in New York. So less crowding like that. I thought that line was hilarious in the piece, but kind of not really the explanation.
What about you, Chase?
You know, I actually moved here from Minnesota, and I've always found that the concept of Minnesota nice is actually really similar to Seattle freeze. And I think a lot of that probably has to do with both of the cultures being rooted in a Nordic culture and also the weather. But I do think that the Seattle freeze does have an impact. And I think that a lot of Washingtonians are sort of secretly and maybe perversely excited about the summer being canceled. You know, every single time. Yeah, every
statement when you're talking about not getting out and congregating in the summertime in Seattle.
I know, but it is like every single time winter ends, there's a certain group of people who are like celebrating online. It's people who, I mean, are bemoaning it online. Like they're sort of like, I wish the rain would come back.
Yeah.
Isn't that Skip or Knute?
Knute's raising his hand.
That's his whole Twitter feed. It's not raining.
Yeah, what do you think even the, like we keep hearing there's no folk life, and the Pride Festival is online, and the block party, the Capitol Hill block party, one thing after another, and now add to that the fact that as we said, just for one example, Amazon is already telling its South Lake Union employees, just stay home till October 2nd. I mean, we don't know how long these restrictions are going to keep getting extended, and what's going to happen with the economy and the virus. A lot of unknowns, but could you imagine being well into the summer and this still going on, and you still think Seattle is so freezy that we would be in any kind of mood?
Well, one of the fun things that is counter to the freeze thing is I've noticed, like in my apartment building, signs have been up on the bulletin board right away where people were saying, hey, if you need someone to help you grocery shop, I'm willing to do that. If you want to get together outside tonight and play music, give me here's my phone number. It's actually, I think, generated a lot of social activity. I also think it's easier, for people who have family. In other words, people might, like me, who might be a little freezy. But I also, one reason I live here is because I have a lot of family here, and we're Zooming and occasionally having distance hellos and that kind of thing. And so I think the social support is incredibly important, obviously, at a time like this. But if you're at all a little bit Nordic and introverted, then part of it is kind of enjoying it.
I want to go back to something you said, Bill, about Amazon and this October thing. So also in the New Yorker piece, one of the things that made Seattle fare better than New York had to do with the fact that Amazon and Microsoft snapped to attention about coronavirus really quickly and allowed stay home work for those who could really quickly. And so you took people off the streets, like 100,000 people were off the streets in a matter of a day or two. That went really quickly. And so that really helped actually here to stop our crowding and our spreading.
When we come back to the Week in Review, we have socially distanced elections in Washington State, but how's that going to work if we don't have a functioning mail system? That and more when the Week in Review rolls on Zoom, on Facebook, on our YouTube channel, in your ears. Stay tuned.
Support for KUOW comes from local Fred Meyer stores. Fred Meyer Associates are working to keep shelves stocked and stores clean, are committed to making a difference in customers' lives, and thank the community for its support. Fred Meyer, fresh for everyone.
This is 94.9 KUOW, Seattle's NPR news station. Sound stories, sound voices. It is sunny and 61 degrees in Seattle. We're expecting a sunny afternoon with a slight chance of rain and a high of 65. It's 12:41. We go back to KUOW's Week in Review.
Week in Review with Bill Radke and my guests, Chase Burns, Knute Berger, and Joni Balter. No guests allowed unless their last name begins with the letter B. President Trump, as we heard earlier, is all about supporting the meat chain, but he seems less inclined to assist the U.S. Postal Service, which has Washington State's Secretary of State, Kim Wyman, worried about our elections.
Our ballots delivery system relies on the USPS. So I really support the idea that it needs to be funded so that we can ensure that we have elections this fall. We will try to work through backup plans like delivering ballots by an alternative carrier, maybe UPS, DHL, who knows, FedEx. The problem with those, just out of the gate, the problem with those delivery methods is, one, they're more expensive, and more importantly, they don't deliver to every PO box in this country, and many of our voters use post office boxes.
Joni, what's the problem with the U.S. Postal Service? Why is it struggling?
You know, I had a hard time believing that it was struggling, thinking about how much everybody's getting everything shipped to them, mailed to them. And at first it didn't make sense to me. I had a conversation with the Secretary of State, Kim Wyman, who explained, and it took some convincing of me, I guess, that if you think about regular business mailings are off, people are mailing less. And so that the business really is suffering. There is some concern that the postal system could be out of money by the end of the summer. In other words, really harming the 5 states, including Washington, that vote by mail. If you've got sort of a wobbly postal system, you might not get your ballots out and back in the time that you need to. So think about it. The whole country is sort of admiring us all of a sudden for our vote by mail. And with this story, I love this story because it has so many different elements. You have the beleaguered post office. You have Donald Trump, who's mad at Amazon because in the post office for not charging Amazon enough, and then his ongoing fights with the Washington Post because the president doesn't like the way the Washington Post covers him. And so there you go. But the truth is, and the more important thing here is that vote by mail, many more states will want to do it and are leaning that way anyway, and our democracy depends on these ballots being returned. And I guess Secretary of State can go to for-profit shipping companies, but as she said, they don't go to post office boxes. So that leaves people out. People who don't have homes, people who are not steady homes, things like that, they will not be able to get ballots that way. So there would be some wrangling if you had to shift to the for-profit shipping companies, they would have to go to post office boxes or make up some amends to cover those people.
Yeah, I also want to say I've literally never really thought about the United States Postal Service and how remarkable that service is. The fact that it goes to, every single mailbox in America, that's something we should be proud of. And I think that, like you said, Joni, many Washingtonians, there will be voter disenfranchisement if we lose this service in some way. We can't all use UPS or a FedEx box.
Yeah, look, the U.S. Postal Service is incredibly essential. It's adapted and changed over the years. People don't send first-class mail much anymore. A lot of Generation Z don't even know what a postage stamp is, if you judge by some of my, my granddaughter and some of her friends. And people send email or there are alternatives to that, but they also are operating under some very onerous rules that Republicans by and large have pushed on them in terms of funding their pension system in a way no one else has to, where they have to put large amounts of the revenue way in advance into the pension system. This was implemented, I think, back in the 90s. And it was designed to kind of cripple the postal system and the unions. Republicans have wanted to, first spinning off the Postal Service, I think was a mistake. But I think it's compounded by this idea that somehow they should pay for themselves. In terms of, there are legal issues that relate to mail privacy and the responsibilities of delivering mail, that make it essential. And it's obviously essential all over the world. If you want to mail a letter to any country in the world, you know, there are agreements that we have with other postal systems that make that work. So I think this is an absolute purposeful sabotage by Donald Trump, both because it, as Joni pointed out, it serves his purpose of damaging Amazon for very petty reasons. And also because he's opposed to vote by mail, because if everyone can vote, it might mean more Democrats than Republicans vote. And it's part of voter suppression. So I think there are two things that come together here that make this a very, very dangerous situation here for the next couple of months. He has said he will not sign any bill bailing out the Postal Service unless they raise their package delivery rates. That's the one area where they're competitive now.
That's the struggle at USPS. I want to start to wrap up the show with Chase. You've been looking at what some less product-focused businesses are doing to survive, but the performing arts. How do you have performing arts in a time of isolation?
You know, you do performing arts sort of like we're doing this call right now. You do a lot of performing arts over Zoom. You have sort of digital buskers in a way. I cover the drag scene in Seattle a lot, and a lot of drag performers have moved from the club and the bar to Instagram Live. So you have a lot of performers who are performing on Instagram and Twitch, and they're mostly performing for tips. And what's sort of surprising is I've talked to some performers and they've said that they've actually made more money in 3 minutes of, you know, on Instagram Live doing a number than they did in 3 hours performing at a club. And so,
I mean, I think I mean, we've already seen today, Zoom is glitchy and it's impersonal, and you're not among the people. How can that be that it would be more successful?
well, I think there's a couple things that are working here. One is that when you go online, you are able to reach more people. So if you have a large following, you are going to be able to reach, I mean, not even a large following, but if you have even a couple thousand people following you, that's going to be a wider audience than at your local bar. But then you also obviously have a lot of outpouring of support that's happening right now, and people want to support performers. And so they're going to tip more than they would normally. And the question is how long is that going to last? Is that going to continue into the future? And will it impact how performers return to clubs? Will they want to if they're realizing that they can do a show on Twitch and they can sort of support themselves?
Okay, I don't know how you possibly capture this on the radio, but we'll try. I want to hear a little audio. This is Our Place has moved to streaming shows on Twitch.
We got another great show for you guys tonight. 16 performers for you. If this is your first time tuning in to Twitch TV / Our Place Seattle, well, welcome to you. The only way this can happen, this is sponsored by, is you guys. They're not getting paid anything guaranteed. They're doing it for the love of their art, and also because they want to get paid a little bit. So you will see on the bottom of the screen their Venmo handles. Please tip them. And you also see videographer Jay Ortiz, his Venmo handle, which is that's MXJ. Please tip them as well. So without any further ado, let's get the show started.
The show is about to start. Places. The show is about to start. You have to show a look, have a look, give a look. Faces. Beautiful. No one ugly allowed.
Wow, direct show on Twitch.
You know what's funny? I've actually been watching that show every Friday, so it's funny that you're playing it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So is this, a lot of businesses are asking, is this the future?
You know, for some businesses, they're going to find that they actually are able to make a bit of additional revenues and funds this way. I don't think that you're going to find that anyone is able to sustain anything like they used to sustain just digitally. But I rent DVDs from Scarecrow Video. I do that all the time. It's a national treasure that's by the University District. They have a huge library of DVDs and VHS tapes. They've started doing a rent by mail program, which a lot of people have been asking for a long time. And, you know, that is probably going to continue into the future. And so the idea is that maybe the funds from that will be able to be additional funds in addition to normal rentals.
Anyone else using, you looking to the arts online?
Well, I know that
the way that we can't do it.
we had to we took Civic Cocktail online. We can't really gather with a lot of folks in one room, and you're right. It had a lot of participants. I was surprised by the number of people who are willing. Now this is still spring, to go inside and do the Zoom or Crowdcast or whatever these things are called. I wonder what the summertime does to all of these events. In other words, we're willing to be inside when it's 60 degrees outside, but what about when it's 75? Are you really gonna wanna just kind of get that computer in the backyard or on the deck and fire that up? Or do you wanna really be outside, you know?
Yeah, the warmer it gets, the more Knute's going to want to stay in and do what? And experience the arts online?
Well, this is not the arts exactly, but the Crosscut staff actually put on a talent show for just for the staff. There was a ukulele performance and poetry and various things. And you see everybody in these little visual tiles. And at the end of it, my impression was it kind of reminded me of old school coffee houses, like we were in the basement of Elliott Bay or the old Last Exit on Brooklyn performing. And so it was sort of fun to see that side of fellow employees.
Here's a bit of the Seattle Symphony that is streaming.
Hi, my name is Brittany Braden, and I'm in the second violin section of the Seattle Symphony. I'd like to share a piece with you that's dear to me. I fell in love with this Grieg sonata when I was very young, and it makes me feel nostalgic, but also hopeful. So this is the second movement of Grieg's third sonata.
And then you can't see it, but there's a drag show going on right now. No, it's not true. So Seattle Symphony making it happen. Any more thoughts on how performance is going to change and then either snap back or permanently feel different?
I think what we're finding right now is that a lot of these platforms that we've pivoted to, like Zoom that we're on right now, or, in the terms of drag shows like on Twitch or Instagram Live, a lot of those platforms obviously were not built for how we're using them now. So those platforms are going to have to adapt and change, and many of them are. But I think we're also going to see competitive platforms appear that are more tailored to, doing a radio show on your computer, or hosting a drag show on your phone. And when we get those new platforms and innovations, that might sort of open everything up a little bit more. And I predict that those innovations might sustain into the future.
Well, sort of
one performance venue has shifted its business model. A Portland, Oregon strip club called Lucky Devil Lounge got shut down as a non-essential business, but they do have a kitchen. So they decided to become a food delivery business called Food to Go. And they will, for a charge, their dancers will deliver food to you. And they also set up a drive-through. Quoting from the Reuters article here, motorized customers were directed into a large tent where they were greeted from stages on both sides by pole dancing women wearing sequined masks and gloves and little else but pasties, G-string bikini bottoms, and stiletto boots. The performances, including throbbing music furnished by a DJ, stage lights, and prizes presented to customers at a safe distance by dancers using long plastic grabbers like those used to pick up litter. One dancer, who goes by the stage name Karma Jane, performed on Friday night in a gas mask. And they interviewed a group of women who drove down from Seattle to see the show. and there are photos of, dancers in skimpy clothes and masks leaning over to take money from drivers' windows. And either it was foggy, they were using dry ice and stage lights. And wow, it struck me as apocalyptic cinema. But one of the dancers says she's worked in the business for 11 years. She said, quote, "I miss the athleticism and the opportunity to make tips. The novelty in these really dark, uncertain times is just enough to pick people up." So before we go here, it's almost the end of the show. Anything picking you guys up? I always like to leave on some silver lining or some, yes, Joni.
I'll do a silver lining. I was having a conversation with somebody and we're talking about, so what good comes out of a time like this in your lives? And I was thinking that I was reading about when Boeing crashed here, a lot of folks went into their garage and started inventing different kinds of things. And so we're all in our homes, we're all going to come up with some new ideas, some new innovations that we don't know going in, how these businesses are adapting and coming up with, can you imagine cars and tents of all things as a way to save a business for a period of time. There will be a lot of innovations, I guess, and hope, and think that that's what I find inspiring at this time.
Yeah, I have a similar silver lining in that, there's a Capitol Hill Arts District streaming festival happening this weekend and right now, and you have all these different arts organizations like the Hugo House is pairing with this DIY venue, the Kame House, and these sorts of partnerships I didn't necessarily see before this time. And so I think that those partnerships and the innovation and the sort of stories that we're sharing right now, I'm hoping will lead to more collaboration in the future.
Knute?
Well, just building off of what Joni said, the Boeing recession starting in 1969, lasting into the 70s, was one of the most incredibly innovative times civically in Seattle in terms of arts groups, parks. This is when we acquired the Burke-Gilman Trail, Discovery Park. This is when bumper shoots started. This is when we reformed the city council. When people were kind of let go from the sort of corporate demands of Boeing, it allowed for a lot of grassroots neighborhood and civic organization that stayed with us. So in addition to the guys going into their garages and inventing new things, citizens in general were very inventive during that period. And so I would hope that whatever dark times we're facing, that kind of grassroots innovation will still take place.
Team, thanks for being innovative and jumping on Zoom and KUOW's YouTube channel and all that kind of stuff, and mostly on the radio, breaking down the week for us. It's always great to see you, even this way. Chase Burns, Joni Balter, Knute Berger, thanks.
Thank you,
Bill.
Chase is digital editor for The Stranger. Knute is editor-at-large at Crosscut. Joni Balter hosts Civic Cocktail on the Seattle channel. I'm Bill Radke. I'm looking forward to doing this all again next week. We're produced by Sarah Leibovitz and streaming by Juan Pablo Chiquiza and Teo Popescu.